The man raised his glass and laughed at her voice. What he meant as a humiliation turned into a quiet reply that toppled a house of lies. This story will trace every secret email, every forged signature, and the unlikely chain of choices that restored her name and upended a company. You will see how a single calm sentence in a crowded dining room became the hinge for an investigation that cost powerful people everything. If this pulls at you, subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you would speak up or stay silent. The chandelier refracted warm light into a web of gold over the marble table. Crystal glasses chimed, voices overlapped into a murmur like surf, and the scent of butter and citrus threaded through the air. Her apron smelled faintly of detergent and coffee oils, and the linen napkins on the table were cool and soft under her fingers. The city beyond the restaurant windows glowed like a field of sodium stars. Emma smoothed the crease in her shirt with a small, nervous motion, fingers grazing the faint scar on the wrist she kept hidden. She moved with the economy of someone practiced at making herself small. But when the man at table 7 called her name, it was not to be served polite company. He wanted to humiliate. He wanted a show. He expected servility. He said in a slow voice meant for cameras that were not there, "You must have come up from nowhere. Did you really think you belonged here?" Emma looked at the woman beside him, a figure wrapped in silk and perfume, and at the others at the table who were already smiling in that way rich people smile when they imagine their own jokes are clever. For a moment, she held herself like any other server, waiting for the insult to pass. Then she replied, quietly and plainly, "I worked the night shift at that lab when they were trying to patent the idea you now sell." The room did not know what to do with a reply that refused the expected tremor of apology. The slap of cutlery paused. Laughter thinned into silence. He tried again, sharper this time. "You can't even pronounce the name of what you stole." She heard the variant syllables of contempt circling like vultures. She repeated, even quieter, "I did not steal anything, but I can show you the metadates if you want to see who wrote the first draft." Pressure built under the chandeliers, and the man, named Nathaniel Cole, felt his control slip. Emma had not planned to start an investigation that night. She had not planned to trade trays for subpoenas. What began as a quiet correction at a dining room led to a message that arrived on her phone in the subway from a number she did not recognize, saying, "We need to talk about your time at Helix Systems." When she opened it, the sender name read Marcus. She would meet him 3 days later at a library that smelled of dust and printer ink, and between those moments she would find an old hard drive, a folder of original files, and a rumor that someone had been rewriting history with forged signatures. Emma was small in public and large in details. She had grown up in a small Midwestern town where her father taught math in a high school and her mother baked pies for church bake sales. She had been the kind of child who disassembled alarm clocks to learn how to measure frequency. At 14, she had won a regional science fair for a prototype that measured enzyme activity in water samples. And at 18, she accepted a scholarship to a technical institute where she learned to code and to write lab protocols that read like music. Her professors called her meticulous. She loved diagrams and footnotes. She loved staying in the lab until the blue light of the computers matched the blue of the morning sky. After college, a recruiter at Helix Systems offered her what sounded like a quiet role in a team that designed diagnostic algorithms. The pay was modest, but her access to cutting-edge research was everything. At Helix Systems, she found both refuge and betrayal. She worked nights because she had cash obligations and a mother recovering from surgery. Nights suited her. The office hummed with air conditioning, and the computers were patient. She wrote modular code and annotated every version. She pushed updates with comments and timestamps, and signed off on drafts with her digital signature. Then the merger happened. A board shuffle brought Nathaniel Code in as Chief Operating Officer, a man with a profile in business journals and a knack for smoothing over inconvenient truths. When a product named Prism went to market, It came wrapped in glossy ads and a promise of revolution. Reviews called it sophisticated. Investors praised the team and the patents. But Emma noticed differences between the Prism release and the draft she had archived. Sections of code had different comments. Author fields showed names she did not recognize. Some timestamps jumped forward, as if the clocks had been reset. She raised questions in the right channels and was told to trust the process, that legal had handled the paperwork, that attribution could be messy in a merger. She learned quickly that the word confidentiality at Helix could be a cage. She left under pressure when her hours grew impossible and the manager she trusted moved on to other opportunities. She told herself she could rebuild. She believed she had moved on. Her backstory carried an ache that was not dramatic. It was the slow accumulation of small injustices. She had a sister named Lydia who lived 3 states away, and a friend named Priya who worked in patent law and had once explained metadates to her over coffee. She had a childhood mentor named Charles who had taught her how to write. A lab notebook in a way that stood up to scrutiny. Those people were anchors and would later be anchors in ways neither of them expected. Emma kept a copy of her old work on a hard drive hidden in a shoebox at the back of a closet. She forgot it existed until the night when the message from Marcus pulled the memory like a thread. The restaurant incident was the spark. The man had wanted to humiliate the waitress, and he had rehearsed every bit of condescension. His voice carried the arrogance of a boardroom, and the certainty of a man who believed his public image as a philanthropist made him untouchable. Emma responded not because she wanted a scene, but because she could not let a lie stand uncorrected in public. The conversation that followed at the table stretched into something that felt like an interrogation and a confession at once. Nathaniel said, "You are mistaken, miss. You were not on that team." Emma said, "I worked on the algorithms, someone labeled as Prism." Nathaniel said, "You were a service worker." Emma said, "I was also a contributor." Nathaniel said, "Why would anyone believe you?" Emma said, "The document metadata does." Nathaniel said, "Where are these documents?" Emma said, "I still have the original drafts." Nathaniel said, "Who is Marcus?" Emma said, "A friend who cares about accuracy." Nathaniel said, "You are accusing me of fraud?" Emma said, "I am pointing out inconsistencies, and I will speak with counsel." The exchange had the slow cadence of a chess game, each line a pawn, each reply a defense. The table tittered. A woman named Jennifer, who worked in venture capital and sat at the head of the next table, looked over and fanned herself. A man called Alan, a startup founder, leaned forward like a juror. People began to take sides without knowing why. After she left the restaurant, the immediate aftermath folded into a small frenzy. Emma returned to her cramped apartment where the radiator clanked and the kettle hissed. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the old shoebox that held the hard drive. Her hands smelled of lemon soap, and the inside of the closet held the dust scent of forgotten things. She plugged the drive into her laptop, and the screen reflected her face like a second window. Files populated in a folder named Drafts, each with a mine of metadata she had once learned to trust. The timestamps were intact. There were authorship notes she had made in the margins. There was also a single email thread that suggested a legal team had discussed attribution months before Prism was announced. Her phone buzzed with the message from Marcus, "Are you safe to meet?" She typed back, "Yes, where?" and they agreed on the library steps at noon. As she closed the laptop, the apartment seemed smaller and larger at the same time, like something had shifted and geometry had changed. First meeting with Marcus took place in a lecture hall turned public study space at the old library. The hall smelled of dry paper and old varnish. Marcus was a collegiate man with a slow, careful voice and a prestige that surprised her. He introduced himself as a consultant who tracked corporate misrepresentation for a small watchdog group, but he had the manner of someone who had lived inside institutional systems and known how to make them talk. He wore a blue wool coat and carried a leather satchel. He had worked at a nonprofit that had sued a major university on behalf of a whistleblower years before, and his name appeared in 2 opinion pieces Emma had read long ago. He said, "I saw the exchange at the restaurant online." Emma said, "How did you see it?" Marcus said, "A video went viral on a private feed." Emma said, "I did not post it." Marcus said, "It does not matter, it brought attention." Emma said, "I have files, but I am afraid." Marcus said, "We do this by steps, we do not go to the press first." Emma said, "Who can we trust?" Marcus said, "We will bring in a forensic analyst and we will check metadates and signatures." Emma said, "What if they sue me?" Marcus said, "You will have counsel." Emma said, "Who will pay?" Marcus said, "The watchdog will fund a preliminary review." Emma said, "Why help me?" Marcus said, "The story matters and you are honest about the small inconvenient truths." That exchange was not tidy court testimony. It was 2 people trying to measure risk together. They agreed to 3 small actions. Marcus would request a confidentiality review, Emma would provide the hard drive and her notes, and Marcus would contact an independent analyst named Sophia who specialized in file forensics. They parted with a sense of an emergent plan, and Emma felt both exposed and strangely buoyed. The investigation moved into a new phase when Sophia arrived. Sophia was deliberate and had both laboratory patience and a sense of humor that made technical discussion easier to bear. She worked from a rented office with acoustic foam on the walls and the smell of coffee like an atmosphere. Her examination of the files revealed a pattern that was small in parts and huge in implication. The metadates showed edits from different user accounts, and some of those accounts traced back to a legal department at Helix that had suddenly created documents after an acquisition. There were signatures that had been pasted into scanned PDFs with inconsistent pressure patterns. Sophia spoke slowly and added small, accessible explanations for technical concepts. She said, "Metadate is like a fingerprint for a file. It records who touched it and when." Emma asked, "Can they rewrite it?" Sophia said, "They can try, but there are server logs and backups that are harder to rewrite." Charles, a retired lab director whom Emma called for advice, suggested they subpoena server backups from the hosting provider if they could build probable cause. That word subpoena felt like a heavy stone, but it was the kind of stone that moves mountains. The due diligence that followed required careful procedural steps and a sequence of legal actions that had to be handled with precision. A legal memo described the steps to compel production of server logs, to request digital preservation orders, and to obtain copies of original patent filings. The memo explained chain of custody, how to authenticate metadata, and the elements of a breach of confidentiality claim. This technical description clarified that to prove a claim about authorship, one needed not only the files, but corroborating emails, timestamps, and witness statements. The memo also noted that forensic hash values could be used to show original copies and to detect tampering. It was methodical and dry, and in its dryness lay the scaffolding for a devastating reveal. Emma, Marcus, and Sophia expanded their circle carefully. They named allies who would play specific roles. There was Priya, the patent attorney who would review ownership claims and draft potential complaints. There was Charles, who remembered the lab notebooks and would testify about lab practices. There was Jennifer, the venture capitalist who had been at the restaurant and who later reached out with a tip about boardroom whispers. There was Alan, who ran a small accelerator and had inside knowledge of investors who had pushed for rapid commercialization. Each person contributed a piece, and the narrative of the case began to look less like a single lonely claim and more like an accumulation of converging proof. The discovery process uncovered emails with redacted names that linked meetings in which PRISM was discussed as early as 8 months before the patent filings had been completed. There were records of a merger meeting where a consultant suggested streamlining authorship to present a cleaner patent application. There was a spreadsheet in which a project was labeled with a code name Emma recognized as one she had used in early drafts. The evidence mounted with the inevitability of a tide. Tension grew in waves. The first major moment of tension arrived when a lawyer from Helix sent a cease and desist letter after Jennifer mentioned the story to an editor. Emma read the letter in the kitchen as rain ticked against the window. She felt both fear and a strange clarity. The letter accused her of defamation and threatened litigation. She typed back a careful reply asking for specifics and copied Marcus and Priya. The second wave came when Helix locked some of Emma's old accounts and requested immediate return of proprietary materials. Emma thought of the shoebox and pressed her palms to it as if to hold the world in place. The third moment came when Sophia called and said she had found a discrepancy in a server log that suggested an after-hours access from a machine registered to Nathaniel Cole. Emma sat heavily in a chair and felt her chest tighten. Each of these moments was a two-paragraph storm of internal memory, of old shame and present determination, and each left Emma with a choice to retreat or to push forward. She chose to push. The confrontation that changed everything was choreographed partly by chance and partly by careful planning. They arranged to present the findings at a board meeting where Helix was scheduled to vote on a new round of funding and where Nathaniel would be present. Marcus secured a closed session with certain board members and arranged for the forensic reports to be included in a confidential packet. The room that day smelled of polished wood and antiseptic. The air conditioning hissed. Investors sat with leather portfolios, and there was a low hum of polite conversation. Emma wore a plain blouse and a small gold chain that had belonged to her mother. She sat at the back with Priya and Charles, and when the packet was distributed, the weight of the paper felt like the weight of consequence. The meeting opened with Nathaniel giving his presentation, speak about trajectory and integration. He used slides that moved with practiced ease and a voice that knew how to command polite applause. Then Marcus stood up and asked for a point of order. He said, "We have discovered inconsistencies." Sophia clarified the technical findings and held up a printout of metadate records. Emma was called forward and read into the record her version of events and her ownership claims. The exchange was electric and each line cut like glass. Nathaniel said, "This is slander. You have no proof." Emma said, "The files are here. Sophie checked them, and the server logs show access from your machine after office hours." Nathaniel said, "Your hard drive could have been manipulated." Sophia said, "We obtained server backups, and the hashes match Emma's original copies." Nathaniel said, "Who funded this inquiry?" Marcus said, "The Watchdog Group and private contributions." Nathaniel said, "You will be sued." Priya said, "We have counsel ready." Nathaniel said, "You are trying to destroy a company." Emma said, "We are asking for honest attribution and accountability." Nathaniel said, "You are naive." Priya said, "You are evasive." Charles said, "I can confirm Emma notes match lab notebooks at the time." Alan said, "Investors should be told." Jennifer said, "As someone who was at the restaurant, I can vouch for the initial exchange that drew attention." The boardroom felt like a courtroom and a theater at the same time. People who had called Nathaniel a visionary now watched him try to hold a collapsing wall. The crucial moment came when Marcus displayed a sequence of emails with header information that matched IP addresses to the office floor where Nathaniel had an executive suite. The room held its breath. Nathaniel paled and then attempted to redirect, speaking of future products and the risk of airing disputes. But the pattern was clear. A key investor, a woman named Evelyn Park, who had been silent, put down her glass and said, "This is not what we invested in." Her voice carried authority and a willingness to act. The vote was delayed and the board reconvened with outside counsel. Nathaniel left the room and did not return that afternoon. After the confrontation, the immediate fallout felt like weather. Helix issued a brief statement about an internal review, and Nathaniel took a leave of absence. Social feeds lit up with speculation, and the story spread to business pages. There were calls with lawyers and a piling up of small actions that together formed a large machine. Contracts were frozen. A scheduled merger was postponed. The media described the situation as messy and uncertain. For Emma, the public attention was uncomfortable and cleansing at once. Some coverage tried to paint her as a disgruntled former employee. Other pieces praised the forensic work and highlighted discrepancies in the patent filings. Legal processes followed, with machine-like regularity. There were motions for preservation of evidence, depositions that stamped time into transcripts, and a forensic audit that required chain of custody procedures. A process description explained that to authenticate a file, one needed the original storage medium, secure hash comparisons, timestamp verification, and corroboration from server backups. This technical outline showed how the team could demonstrate that documents had been altered after certain dates and that signatures had been appended. The legal process was meticulous and slow, and it changed the pace of Emma life into a calendar of hearings and interviews. Names multiplied in the public account. Board members reacted in interviews. Evelyn Park spoke to a reporter about fiduciary duty. Jennifer granted a background briefing. Alan tweeted a cautious note about investor confidence. A junior engineer at Helix named Priam offered a conflicting account and was later identified as a source who had been asked to modify attribution entries. Charles provided an affidavit about lab practices. Sophia gave a sworn expert opinion on file forensics. The community of people who had been touched by the case now formed a chorus, and their statements interlocked. Each new piece of evidence tightened the noose around the constructed narrative Nathaniel had relied upon. Moments of private tension continued to arrive. One evening, Emma received a voicemail that made her hands numb. The voice said, "Stop. This will ruin more than just your career. We will make sure you owe money." She called Marcus and Priya, and they set up a plan to document threats. Another night, there was an anonymous package at her door containing a legal notice and a photograph of an old team outing meant to intimidate. Emma chose to go public with the threats, and the paper that covered the story escalated the pressure on Helix further. Each pressure point was a paragraph long, full of memory of fear and of small acts of courage that pushed the story forward. The legal resolution began in mediation and moved into a settlement negotiation. Under pressure from investors and a growing risk of criminal inquiry, Helix agreed to a mediated settlement that included a public correction of authorship, restitution in the form of licensing fees, and a requirement to revise certain patent claims. The settlement also included a clause for an independent monitor to review future attribution on projects. Nathaniel resigned from his executive role and faced an internal investigation. He later paid fines and lost certain stock options. The company issued a public statement acknowledging that attribution procedures had been flawed and promising reforms. The epilogue unfolded and measured time. 1 month later, Emma found that life had not returned to ordinary, but had a new rhythm. She had legal documents that restored her authorship on the initial PRISM modules and a modest settlement that included a grant to support her starting a small consultancy. She met with Charles for coffee, and they both laughed with relief and disbelief. Her phone rang with requests for interviews that she declined, preferring to set boundaries. She visited her mother and gave her a small watch she had repaired for the occasion. The watch ticked with a sound that seemed to mark the first day of a different life. The city felt less heavy and more honest. She spent time with Priya and Marcus in a quiet dinner where they spoke of next steps and of care. Emma allowed herself a small celebration with people who had stuck by her. It was an evening of grilled fish and soft conversation, and in that domestic calm she felt a stitch in her chest begin to loosen. 3 months later, Emma had launched a consulting practice focusing on ethical attribution and corporate process audits. She rented a small office above a bakery that smelled of yeast and sugar and placed on her desk a framed page from an early lab notebook, the handwriting of a younger self that did not look ridiculous anymore. Her consultancy signed a first contract with a nonprofit that needed help auditing research projects. The press pieces had shifted from sensational headlines to thoughtful profiles about corporate culture and the importance of integrity. Nathaniel had pursued a countersuit, but it was dismissed on grounds of insufficient evidence once the server backups and hash verifications were presented. Emma had gained a small measure of public recognition, but more importantly, she had regained control over the narrative of her work. Marcus continued to consult, and there had been an awkward human conversation between them that felt like the start of something tender. One evening, Marcus walked Emma to a train, and they shared a long talk about vulnerability and the slow work of trust. It was not a dramatic romantic moment, but a sequence of quiet steps. He said, "I was not looking for a partner in this. I was just looking for integrity." She said, "Integrity is the only thing that remains when everything else gets complicated." He smiled, and that smile was the slow unfolding of a possible future that did not require grand gestures. 6 months later, Helix had implemented new procedures for attribution, including an internal system that logged contributions at a granular level and required independent verification before publication. The company paid a penalty and offered to fund training programs in research ethics. Nathaniel had left the industry to pursue a quieter life and faced ongoing civil inquiries that limited his ability to serve as an officer in other firms. The community reaction had shifted the conversation about startup culture and credited people who had previously been invisible. Emma had signed a licensing agreement that compensated her for the early modules and used part of the funds to seed a fellowship for young women in technical research. She hired Priya to help run legal aspects of the fellowship, and Charles came on as an advisor. Marcus and Emma had grown closer in a way that felt like mutual respect first and a slowly deepening affection second. On a late autumn evening, under a row of street lamps, Marcus surprised Emma with a small, public but intimate promise. He said, "I want to build something beside you, not above you." She said, "That is all I ever wanted." He asked if she would consider moving in together, and she laughed softly and said yes. The gesture was unshowy and earnest, and it fit the shape of their days. In the public record, the case concluded with tangible measures. The settlement included an agreement to return or reassign certain patent credits, to pay a specified restitution sum, and to fund a compliance program. Several statements from regulators emphasized the importance of robust record-keeping and the need to verify authorship through technical means like hash verification and server log audits. The headlines faded, but the structural change remained. Emma kept a small ritual that marked the journey. Each month, she sent a brief note to her old lab group, thanking them for the experiments they had run together. She kept a folder of emails and a small box that now held letters from people who had been affected by similar injustices. Her reputation was no longer fragile. It had been tested and had proved resilient. The last image is simple and resonant. Emma stood on a rooftop in late winter, wind lifting the collar of her coat, and watched the city breathe steam in the cold air. Her hands were bare. She felt the roughness of a paper in her pocket, a printout of an old lab note that once felt like the last proof of her worth. Now it felt like a map. She thought of everything that had been taken and everything she had put back, of friends who had arrived unexpectedly, and of lovers who had become partners in work and life. The truth had arrived through patient accumulation, through small acts of preservation, and through the courage to speak quietly when the world expected a show. He had tried to humiliate Waitress, and instead had set in motion the unpeeling of a lie. The quiet reply at a dinner table had become a pivot that changed reputations and policies. If you believe in accountability, if you believe that integrity matters, subscribe and share this story so more voices demanding the truth are heard. Remember this image, the city steam and the paper in her pocket, because it shows that a small, steady person can make a room stop and listen, and that the work of rebuilding is often slow and also deeply human.